Chapter 5. Marching Down the Road to War. From our very first day in the Jungvolk, we accepted it as natural law that a leader's orders must be obeyed without question, even if they appear foolish or harsh. It was the only way to avoid chaos. The chain of command started at the very bottom with us children and ended with Hitler. One bitter day in November, Bernd Horsch, our 15-year-old Fatherland marched all 160 of us into an ice-cold river because our singing had displeased him. We cursed him bitterly under our breath, but not one of us refused. That would have been the unthinkable crime of disobeying an order. During the war, such a refusal could have the person shot before a firing squad. The rules were strict, the punishments harsh. But by year's end in 1938, membership in the Hitler Youth topped 7 million. The 4 million boys and girls who had not yet joined soon found themselves with no choice. In March of 1939, the Nazis passed a law requiring all Aryan children to join the Hitler Youth. Kids were now drafted into the Hitlerjugend, just as their elders were drafted into the Wehrmacht. Few of them minded the strict discipline, and most welcomed it. No matter how tough an order, they followed it to prove their loyalty to the Reich and to the new Germany. Social class made no difference. Rich kids and poor, educated and unschooled, all became one in the Hitler Youth. They learned to appreciate and count on each other. Willingly, they worked together, side by side. Parents who objected to the heavy doses of Nazi training dished up in the Hitler Youth knew better than to complain. If they tried to stop their children from joining, the Nazis could take the children away and place them in orphanages, or with other, more loyal families. But most parents didn't object. In fact, they welcomed the supervision and discipline offered by the Hitler Youth Patrol Force. The Streifendienst would haul any youngster under 14 out of a local movie house at 9 p.m., the curfew hour before the war. A second offense could cost the parents a fine and the boy a couple hours of punishment drill on a Sunday afternoon. Punishment was too harsh to permit much juvenile delinquency. Delinquents could be expelled from the Hitlerjugend, which meant the end of any meaningful career in Nazi Germany. The greatest gripe that most parents had with the Hitler Youth was that it kept children from helping with the chores on the family farm. But that problem was answered in 1939 when the government passed the Reich Youth Service Law. This law required each child to take part in land service during the summer and fall to help harvest the crops. At age 18, girls spent a full year helping out on the farm, doing both housework and chores in the field. Boys of 18 went in the labor service, where they performed a combination of land work and military training. Secretly, some parents resented the clash between Nazi ideals and the churches. They did not like it when Hitler Youth leaders made fun of religion in front of their children, nor did they appreciate the scheduling of Sunday parades during church hours. And yet, they dared do little about it. Certainly the young people did not care. They felt proud and privileged to serve the fatherland. Out of the ashes of discouragement and poverty, Adolf Hitler had molded a generation of healthy, happy, physically fit, and fiercely loyal young Germans. The pride with which they marched and sang showed how confident they were that soon they would rule the world. It was a time of great hope and promise for millions of young people. Alfons Heck spent summer Sundays of 1939 as an altar boy. His grandmother, a devout Catholic, tolerated his Hitler Youth activities as long as they didn't interfere with her plan for him to become a priest. "Don't ever forget," she constantly reminded him, "what comes after the soldier thing." Often, Alfons served Mass wearing his full Hitler Youth uniform, including the belt and dagger, beneath his altar boy robes. Parades that summer were full of the joy of marching and singing. The ominous darkness that hung over much of the world seemed not to affect the Hitler Youth. Few of them realized that this summer would be the last of their peaceful childhoods. Although he was only 11, Alphonse, like most other young Germans, would soon be thrown into adulthood. On the morning of September 1st, 1939, I was awakened by the fanfare blast on the radio from the kitchen below my bedroom. It was Sondermeldung, a special bulletin on the Deutschlander, the national radio network. Hurriedly, I jumped out of bed and ran downstairs. "What's going on?" I asked my Aunt Maria, and then I saw tears in her eyes. "Our troops went into Poland this morning," she replied tonelessly. "We are at war." With that, I was wide awake. "It's about time," I shouted. "The Poles have mistreated our people much too long." "Why don't you keep your mouth shut, Dividamater? Idiot," she screamed. "Don't you know that hundreds of young men are dying at this very hour? This isn't one of your dumb Hitler Youth exercises." For millions of German teenagers, the age of innocence and great promise had just ended. World War II had begun. The attack on Poland was simply an excuse for the power-hungry Hitler to grab more land. All summer, SS official Reinhard Heydrich had been working on the plan. His men would stage an attack on a German radio station near the Polish border, but they were told to make it look as if they were defending themselves against an attack by the Poles. The first news broadcast from the German capital in Berlin claimed that Polish soldiers had started the fighting. Reports said that the Germans had simply returned the fire in self-defense. That story was, of course, untrue. Hitler now announced that to protect the German frontier, he was sending troops to the Polish border. What he sent was a force of 1.5 million soldiers to smash a Polish army just one-third that size. It was Blitzkrieg again, lightning war. With the speed of lightning, German ground troops and aircraft swept into Poland. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, immediately destroyed most of the Polish air force before its planes ever had a chance to leave the ground. At last, Europe responded. Britain and France put their armies on ready alert, and leaders issued a warning. If Germany did not withdraw from Poland immediately, they would jump in on the side of the Poles. Hitler now accused the British of pushing Poland to start war. Secretly, he was sure that Britain, France, and the other allies would do just what they had done before, threaten, but never take action. This time, Hitler's bluff was called. At 11 a.m. on September 3rd, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. 6 hours later, France joined the fight. Before the day was over, India, Australia, and New Zealand also had become part of the Allied force in a war against the Third Reich. But the Allies proved to be of little help. By September 15th, Poland's capital city of Warsaw was now surrounded by German troops. Most of the Polish army was destroyed. Germany demanded the surrender of Warsaw, but the angry Poles refused. Massive bombing raids followed. It was a one-sided fight, and yet the ill-prepared and outdated Polish army fought on. By the 1st of October, however, only small groups of Poles scattered around the country were still holding out against the Nazis. They didn't last long. Resistance ended on October 6th. Poland was defeated. That same day, Hitler made a speech from the Reichstag, the home of the German parliament. He was content with his gains, he said, and he was ready for peace with the Allies. "Germany has no further claims against France," he announced. "Nowhere have I ever acted contrary to British interest." The bitter Allies were scornful. "Past experience has shown," said Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, "that no reliance can be placed upon the promises of the present German government." While Hitler was pledging peace, his men were meeting with Russian leaders to divide Poland between them. The country would be split roughly in half, according to a pact the two countries had signed before the fighting ever began. No sooner had Poland been divided than the Führer issued a new decree against its people. The Poles were a danger to the Reich and the German community, he claimed. They were getting in the way of Lebensraum, and the solution was simple. The Polish people could leave their homeland or face death. The new Nazi leader in Poland, Hans Frank, immediately barred all Poles from riding in taxis, using restrooms and train stations, taking part in sports events, using public parks, or phone booths, and other similar liberties. As in Germany, Jews were made to wear the yellow Star of David. The penalty for disobeying the German authority was death. In his diary, Hans Frank wrote, "The Poles will be the slaves of the German Reich." Meanwhile, Hitler was secretly preparing his military leaders for the next attack: France and the Low Countries of Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Publicly, he still claimed to want peace with Britain, but now the Allies knew better than to trust Adolf Hitler. This mistrust was not shared by most of the German people. Hitler Youth members, Alphonse among them, believed their Führer was the mightiest of all world leaders. I knew that whatever the Führer decided would be right for Germany. Part of the belief was due to our brainwashing in the Hitler Youth and our schools, but part of it was our feeling that we were smarter than our elders. My first Latin teacher, whom we called the Cuckoo, tried to warn us about the cocky attitudes as we entered the upper school. "Most of you don't belong here," he sneered, "and at least 50% of you won't be around for graduation." He thought half of us would fail our studies, but his prediction proved true in a different way. More than half of my classmates would not graduate because they'd be dead before they reached age 18. World War II had begun, but so far there was very little fighting. In German classrooms, there was still little talk of war. Most students continued their studies as usual, without interruption. As the world watched and waited for something to happen, many began to call this the phony war. Millions of Germans, Alphonse's uncle Franz among them, predicted that the storm in France and the Low Countries would never break. "It's just propaganda," he claimed. "What would Hitler do with France anyway?" But others, like Alphonse's grandmother, were not convinced. "Hitler won't rest until he's gotten back the Alsace-Lorraine," she maintained, referring to German land that the French had taken at the end of World War I. "My God, Mother," cried Franz, "Hitler made an agreement with the French saying he wouldn't take any more land. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "No wonder any fool can beat you at a cattle deal," she shot back, fixing him with a cold stare. "He said the same thing about Poland just 6 months ago. All he wanted then was a little more Lebensraum. Don't you remember?" On the streets of many towns and cities, the numbers of German soldiers increased every week. Tanks and other heavy equipment now rumbled through Wittlich on a regular basis. The smoke of the phony war was getting thicker, and people predicted that soon it would burst into flame. Christmas that year seemed to hold a promise of peace for most folks in our town, but with the first signs of thaw, more troops poured into the villages and towns along the border. Every home in Wittlich had to take in soldiers, but most families didn't mind. They were paid a few marks per day, and it gave them a feeling of security. There was the strictest blackout at night. Anyone careless enough to let a sliver of light show through a window was warned only once, usually by us eagle-eyed air raid workers at the Hitler Youth. A second offense drew a heavy fine, and we sometimes abused our authority by hurling a rock through a window that showed the slightest crack of light. That winter was one of the coldest in memory. I spent much of my free time skating on the solidly frozen river Leiser that bordered the meadow behind our farm. At band practice, our fanfares stuck to our lips. Finally, the snow rose so high that all rallies were called off, but we still had to make the rounds, helping with the air raid defense. Being only 25 miles from France, as the bullet flies, we were well aware that a French cannon mounted on a railroad flat car could hurl ammunition right into the middle of the Wittlich marketplace.